All right. Hello, friends. Welcome to this week's installment of our Community Center Development Foundations course. Today, we're going to dive into our first principle, the positive principle. This is one of our favorites. It's the building block on which all the other principles come. So here's how we define the positive principle. By focusing on strengths and assets instead of needs and deficiencies, the community is able to grow the building blocks needed for their own development, while at the same time building a mentality of hope and self-belief. The positive principle is really, it's just all about our mindset and our vision. How are we perceiving what we see? Take this glass of water, for example. When you look at this glass, what do you see? Is it half full or is it half empty? Of course, how we answer this question reveals so much about our mindset, right? We can see the glass is both, right? It's half full and it's half empty. But what matters is how we focus our attention and how we interpret what we see. There's a really great verse in Proverbs that we love that characterizes this principle. Even in laughter, the heart may ache, and even in joy, there may be grief. In our lives and in our communities, there will always be both, right? There will be problems and challenges and deficiencies, and there will be gifts and strengths and assets. And it's all about how we perceive what we're seeing, how we interpret what we're seeing, and letting God give us vision for the things that He sees. I'm going to share a quick story from my past. When I was a teacher, I used to teach high school theater and English. And I had this great group of students. It was a pretty rural community, many of my students living under the poverty line and with food insecurity. So we were working with minimal resources. My computer just went black. Sorry about that. We were talking about putting on a play, and my students started to get really passionate. And so I was like, okay, let's put on a play. I went to the principal, I asked for a budget, and she said, sorry, we don't have any money for you. But my students, they were not deterred. They were like, well, my grandma has a dress that would work for this, or maybe we could borrow chairs from the art classroom to create this set. And little by little, students activated teachers, activated their families, and they gathered what they needed to put on a beautiful piece of theater. So we didn't have a budget, but we had passion. This group of students you can see here on the slide, they went on to put on 5 full-length plays and musicals. And every time we had a full house, we sold out all of our tickets because the whole community was so engaged with what these students were doing, because they were so inspired by their passion to make it happen when the resources that they initially thought that they needed weren't available. So we love this example of the positive principle because really it's about interpreting what we see and beginning with the question. Instead of what do we lack, we start with the question, what do we have? And we're all about applying this mindset and principle into our community-centered development work. I'm going to pass it on to Jamie, who's going to talk a little bit more about this.
Well, most of you know where our name comes from, the 5 and 2 network. You know, this is such a powerful story that articulates so clearly our approach to doing community development and a pathway towards community flourishing, so that we chose that as our name. So it comes from John chapter 6 in the Bible, and it's the story of feeding of the 5,000. And we'll just go over the story really quickly here. Jesus came along, and clearly there was a social problem, right? And in this case, it was hunger. In your case, it might be, it's an agriculture. It could be health, could be peace, could be something else. But we're all encountering these kind of social problems in our communities. And so Jesus said, "Hey, what are we going to do?" What an incredible question for really the most powerful human to say, "Hey, what can you do?" Trying to activate the power of those around him. And so one of his disciples, Philip, stands up, and he's a problem solver. He says, I'm going to go see what I can do. And he starts counting people and calculating in his head, how are we going to solve this need? And so Philip answered, It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. And so, thinking back to Kendra's glass half full and half empty, we see that he saw the half empty part of the glass. It's so easy to do when we see so many needs and problems around us. But there was another disciple, Andrew, who recognized that there was this young boy here, and this boy had the courage and the generosity to say, here's my lunch. Basically, this is what I have: 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, why would he say that in the midst of such a significant problem? Well, he started with what he had. Jesus said, have the people sit down. And so they did. And they started passing around the loaves and the fish. And in some miraculous way, everybody was fed. And I'm telling you guys that this is the kind of miracle that is happening through the process of community centered development. And I can't articulate exactly how it happens, but somehow through the power of generosity, through the power of association, and through the courage of people following the momentum principle that we're going to talk more about, um, community development is happening in this way. And when I really started to practice CCD, I told you earlier a story of my time in Bukavu, where my mindset was really shifted away from a needs-based development to asset-based development. I began to go, and I lived in Thailand at the time and working all throughout Asia, really with one tool in my toolbox. And that tool was to ask the question, what do you have? And so when people came to me with proposals, with problems, with needs, with deficiencies, I didn't ignore those things, but I started with the question, what do you have? What are you doing? What are you passionate about? What's your vision for this place? Who do you know? How can you activate them? Because I know that they're overlooking what's in their basket, their 5 and 2. And I want to tell you a quick story of one group that really activated this principle, and they're close friends of ours and close friends of 5 and 2 Network. Here you see some of these folks here with Daniela, and they live in a very poor area of Kinshasa called Monkafula. And so here's a group of young people, college age or younger, and they recognize that they're in a really impoverished setting. There's conflict, there's violence around them, there's a lack, there's a deficiency, there's a need. But instead of just seeing the glass half empty, they say, what are we going to do about it? Well, they don't have money, they don't even have jobs. What can they do? They have healthy bodies, and they go out and they decide, we're going to start picking up garbage. You can see here in this image how much garbage and waste just gets thrown out. People don't care about the community in the way that they should. And as they did that, they stopped in at households and they started to just kind of educate people about what they can do with their waste. And the next step for them was to start repairing some of these streets. And you can see here the damage to the streets. This used to be a road that people could drive their cars up and down. And because of erosion and the water just kind of flowing along and bringing all the debris and the waste along, they become untenable to drive on these roads. And so look at this, you see all these people come out and they begin to fix the roads. And what happened is, as people began to recognize what they have and move forward to solve their own problems, the energy pulsed through this community. More and more young people came out. People began to feel a burden and a responsibility for their own community. So their numbers grew, and their association got to more than 100 people. People started to donate money, and of course their time, and of course their abilities. And the next step was they drew a community map. And with that map, they began to make plans. What can we do next? How can we fix more roads? How can we do more things? And they started to advocate for the community in a number of different ways. They advocated to the local electricity company because they were getting a bad deal from them, and they negotiated as a group. They began to work with the local healthcare provider. They had really creative ideas where they would use their professional services. So some of these young people, they could go and do some cleaning. They could work on some of them had trades, electrical or plumbing, and they could exchange them for credit or even medical services. So they could actually use these credits to give to elderly people in the community so they could go and get the healthcare that they needed. So it's one example of how just starting with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, this small amount that they had, and they moved forward with generosity and with courage, and they said, let's start with what we have. It made an incredible impact, and now they're this large organization that's still voluntary and association driven, but a remarkable story nonetheless. And so, um, in the Bible, we see this constant over and over again. We see these words to give thanks. And I find this really remarkable that this command comes at us over and over. Why is God asking us constantly to give thanks, to give thanks? Is that because he wants us to have good manners? Is it because God wants to receive credit for the things that he's done for us? Well, no, I think it's because God knows that in the process of giving thanks, something transformative happens to us, because giving thanks is to recognize the things that we have. When we're thankful, we recognize the abundance of provision all around us. And we also recognize where it comes from. We know that God provides for us. And so it's an important avenue for us to move into this glass half full mentality. And fundamentally, we need to understand that it's about, in our community, working with people is changing paradigms, changing their ways of thinking, and moving them from problems and deficiencies towards assets and liabilities. And so these are just an example here. You can see on the slide questions that previously you may have asked, or are quite prevalent in the world of development, is to say, hey, what are the problems? What do we have missing? What are our challenges? You can see on the other side, what do we replace these needs-based questions with? What's your vision? What do we have? What are the opportunities here? What is working already? Not just what's dysfunctional here. What is working? What are some people doing that we can continue with? And what excites us? What are we passionate about? And what can we do ourselves? And so those are some questions that we use as a starting point as we move into community-centered development. So I'm going to hand it over to Daniela.
Yeah, shifting the collective focus of a community from that negative based, almost our default type of thinking, to a positive mindset. It's a simple concept, as simple as, like Kendra said, half full or half empty, but it sure isn't easy. And actually, I don't even think it's possible to do this if individual community members are living out of a false view of themselves, or maybe out of a narrow view of themselves. So to foster the sense of abundance, you as facilitators, you have this amazing opportunity to guide community members to reflect on some questions that would cultivate this positive principle in each individual community member. So these questions are, who am I? Like, what is my story? What is my identity? Secondly, what is my purpose? Or what's my calling in this life? And thirdly, do I even have what I need to accomplish this purpose? Do I have the skills or the tools or the gifts? So the first one, who am I? And if I'm honest, when I ask this question of myself, it's very easy for me to default on the lackings or the weaknesses. I'm too impatient, not smart enough, that person's better than me, etc. Sometimes those lies have a voice and they speak things to me like I'm worthless, I'm poor, no one loves me or cares about me, I'm unwanted and I'm unneeded. And while it is true that I'm not perfect, what's important is that I see what is true about who I am. And as someone who is a Christian, I look at who God says I am. And I know that he says I am loved, I'm his child and valuable, so valuable that he came to redeem and rescue me from all of my imperfections. And even more than that, he actually literally lavishes gifts on me. And when I think about myself in this light, my lackings start to fade away. And I can then turn my attention and focus on my abundance. So I want to share an example of this by introducing you to a very special person in my life. This is my grandfather, who I called Opa, and his name was Heinrich Lowen, and he's the one on the left. And this is a photo of him just after World War II, shortly after he had to flee from Paraguay. So when you look at him, I'm guessing the first thing that you notice about him is the fact that he had only one leg. And that is the most obvious physical characteristic about him. But to me, is really just a bullet point on my list of who he was, because he didn't let his lackings diminish his identity, his purpose, and his gifts. And when I asked myself why was he the person he was, I realized it's his mindset. He could have focused on his emptiness and his lackings. He was poor. He only had one leg. He was a refugee. He lost his home. His family had all died or were in Russia. And instead, he focused on his abundance, the community who he had escaped with, his humor, his farming abilities, how skilled he was with his hands in woodworking, and the heart that he had for the marginalized, and his faith. And with this mindset, he scratched out a whole new future for himself. And so I remember him full of abundance, not full of lackings. He knew who he was and where his identity lied. So as facilitators and community leaders, we get to engage our community members in these kinds of questions. Another one is, what is my purpose? What is my calling? This is a huge question, and some people spend their whole lives trying to figure it out. And sometimes that question can be so overwhelming that the default becomes, I have no purpose. I can't do anything. No one needs me, and I have no hope. But when this question overwhelms me, particularly, I remind myself that I'm part of a bigger story. It's not just all about me. God has a purpose and a plan for my life that I'm part of, and that gives me hope. And again, it's simple, but it's not easy. And I believe that my purpose is to love God and to love those around me. And more specifically, what do I have? Well, like I said before, I'm lavished with gifts. It might be gifts of the heart. It might be gifts of the hand. It might be gifts of the head. There's so many different gifts that we've been given. And he placed a unique combination of passions, gifts, and opportunities that have helped me to narrow out what my calling is. And man, to discover this and to connect these with other people for the flourishing of my own community and bring glory to God, that's truly shifted my mindset from nothing to something abundant. And it's a continual process of rediscovering who I am, what is my calling and my gifts, so that I can do my part in God's big story. And what really motivates me is to cultivate this principle what really motivates me is when I think about each of my community members viewing themselves with this kind of a lens, with the lens of truth. And I think, imagine if we all thought of ourselves like that, what could be possible in our community? And that's what the positive principle is all about.